Hello and welcome to today's webinar. Our topic for today, you've outgrown your procurement tools, turning growing pains to ROI gains for mid-size and high-growth organizations. A couple of housekeeping notes just before we get started here today. As we go through the presentation, please feel free to enter any questions that you may have through the Q&A chat box in the WebEx platform. We'll do our best to get to as many of those questions as we can, and subsequent to today's webinar, within the next 24 to 48 hours, you'll receive an email that will include the slide deck and access to the recorded link for the webcast to share with any of your colleagues as well. So just by way of introductions, my name is Richard Waugh. I'm Vice President of Corporate Development for Zycus, your host for this webcast. You see a little bit of my background included here. I'd rather tell you a little bit more about Zycus. We're an end-to-end provider of source-to-pay software solutions, so an integrated suite across source-to-pay, a recognized leader in the space. And we also make it part of our strategy to partner with some of the best providers of implementation and consulting services to enable these kinds of best-of-breed software solutions. And I'm pleased to be joined by my partner for today's webcast and Zycus's partner, VSG, Velocity Sourcing Group. So T. Grant Dearborn is the managing partner at VSG. He's got 20 years in the space, recognized as a pro to know by Supply and Demand Chain magazine, has extensive experience implementing across this source-to-pay continuum that I mentioned, similar to the Zycus Solution Suite, and Grant is co-founder of VSG Velocity Sourcing Group. Welcome to today's webinar, Grant.
Thank you, Richard. Looking forward to participating.
Awesome. So we're off and running. Let me give us a little bit of an overview for what we intend to cover today by way of an agenda. We are focusing on mid-market and high-growth organizations and the critical needs for those types of organizations to really transform the procurement process. And certainly part of the, what we're postulating here is that the starting point really needs to include P2P as sort of the cornerstone of a transformation program for a mid-market or high-growth organization. And the good news is there's really been a renaissance, if you will, in the P2P space. And we'll first look at what's driving this rebirth, if you will, the P2P 2.0. What are some of the key market dynamics, emerging trends, and key innovations that have really generated this kind of renewed interest in e-procurement, procure-to-pay, which after all first came online sort of at the turn of the century, if you will, which makes it sound really old, but in the 1998, 1999 timeframe. So fairly mature space from a technology standpoint, but lots of new innovation in the space that makes it much more compelling initiative and more accessible, quite frankly, than ever before to mid-market and high-growth enterprises. And given that focus, we really want to next drill into what are some of the key challenges that those organizations are facing. Certainly they're going through growing pains as they ramp up their operations and certainly see the strain in terms of many of the underlying systems, infrastructures, and underlying processes such as procurement to accommodate the growth. And we really want to focus in on how can these types of organizations flip that switch from a procurement standpoint to really expend less of their resources on tactical procurement activities and become more and more strategic. And next we'll segue to kind of a vision for success. What does success look like? How can these best-in-class and best-of-breed technologies be adopted effectively by a mid-market organization? And certainly, one of the biggest changes here is that it's not just for the large enterprises anymore. It's more affordable, more accessible to mid-market organizations to gain the same kind of competitive advantages that many of the larger enterprises have been enjoying for years, and that's certainly a welcome change in the market. We'll look at what are some of those top performer best practice characteristics that newer adopters of P2P 2.0, if you will, should be emulating when they go down this path. And part and parcel of that is often, how do I put together a compelling return on investment and business case to justify the investment in this type of initiative? And it's always helpful to model success that others have experienced. So we'll share a couple of transformational case studies that really exemplify how similar types of organizations have achieved best-in-class type performance with a best-of-breed transformation process and procurement. And of course, we'll start with a playbook and a roadmap. Where do I start? What comes next? How do I get up and running, and get up and running quickly? Because mid-market and high-growth organizations in particular don't have the luxury of lots of resources or lots of time to make an impact very quickly. And we'll talk about how this can be accomplished in the first wave, certainly in 90 days or less, so very rapid implementation. And then going forward, we'll kind of paint a picture for what comes next on the roadmap. How could I transition and leverage from automating transactional procurement such as P2P into a full source-to-pay transformation approach. So a pretty ambitious agenda for us today. So let's jump right in and get started by looking at what's going on in the P2P market today. And as I said, there's really been a renaissance, a 2.0 kind of reboot, if you will, of P2P. And one of the ways to start, if you're in the discovery process, trying to sort of gather information and do some research on what's going on in this market, is to look at what some of the leading analysts or influencers in the space are saying. And one recommendation here is to look at a very recent report from Forrester Research, the Forrester Wave for e-procurement, published in the second quarter of this year. And as you see here, Zycus is in the leaders wave of that evaluation, where they looked at 12 different vendors overall. And Zycus was one of a very select group of leaders recognized by Forrester. And if we look at some of the overall trends that Forrester cited in that report, certainly they see a lot of activity. The market is growing rapidly. In fact, at 11% per year, so double-digit growth rate in the market certainly indicates that it's a thriving area that a lot of organizations are currently not only investigating but investing in. And so in fact, whereas the market was valued at $3.8 billion, so this is really a software market valuation in 2016, growing to $4.3 billion in 2017. So what's driving that kind of growth? Well, certainly it starts with solutions that are easier to use, that can facilitate a streamlined, simplifying process to make routine purchases. And one of the interesting nuggets that comes out of the Forrester report, we hear so much of the hype around sort of business to consumer activity, and even businesses going to sellers' e-commerce websites to transact business. Whereas in the Forrester report, they report out that the volume of purchases from a business to business or business to enterprise as compared to businesses going to sell-side websites is more than 3 times greater. So $3 trillion in business-to-business transactions just amongst the 12 e-procurement providers that Forrester evaluated in this report really dwarfs the activity of what's going on for businesses to actually go directly and buy from sell-side e-commerce sites. And there's a reason for that. When business users go and shop directly at sell-side e-commerce sites, they're encouraged, in fact, to make maverick purchases. They're going to be exposed to all types of items that aren't approved for them to buy. They may be exposed to retail pricing as opposed to contracted pricing. So it's really something that in this P2P 2.0, the strategy here is to provide that ease of use, that consumer-like experience, but do it within a more controlled purchasing environment such that you know that users are making better procurement decisions, buying from approved contracted vendors, and only at negotiated prices. So that's how these systems are really driving improved compliance, but also generating much better insights on buying behaviors, analytics, to really show what items of products or services are most requisitioned by your end user, so that you can do a better job of negotiating strategic agreements with those suppliers, finding the right suppliers and the right items to satisfy your end users, as an example. The other thing that these types of systems enable is not just spend management, but more effective demand management. So if I get better visibility to in-flight purchases, before a commitment's actually been made, where there's a requisition in the process, I can not only channel that demand to approved contracted vendors, but in some cases I could defer or deny spending before the purchases are actually made. So lots of advantages in greater control, coupled with an improvement in ease of use for the end users, that the B2B systems are more closely emulating the user experience in a consumer model, such as buying at an Amazon or shopping online for other types of purchases, is driving this type of dramatic growth in the market and this renaissance for P2P. A few of the other key findings that Forrester noted in this WAVE report really focuses on some of the innovations that are driving this growth. So, for instance, a key finding is that artificial intelligence, analytics, and customer centricity are really key differentiators. And the quote from Forrester here is that leaders need exceptionally smart, easy-to-use e-procurement software because modern users, which I would read as the millennials that are the next wave of the workforce, and which have grown up, let's face it, on Facebook and Amazon and others, would reject mediocre e-procurement software and instead be tempted to go buy from marketplace sites. So it really reinforces the notion that if you want to achieve all those benefits of higher user adoption, compliance, and control, you have to make sure that you're giving those end users an attractive shopping experience. And of course, as noted in the report here, Zycus in particular has been identified as one of those innovators that's leveraged a great reputation for easy-to-use software and using artificial intelligence to make this activity more of a guided buying environment for users, so intelligent pop-ups that enable approvers to see relevant information about a purchase requisition, or mobile applications as differentiators as well. So a lot of different areas in which innovation has driven this renewed interest in P2P. I think one of the other key findings here is that Forrester notes that choosing a procure-to-pay solution is a long-term bet. After all, when you look at your user footprint internally, almost any employee could potentially be at least an occasional user of your purchase-to-pay platform. Making the occasional purchase transaction or utilizing the system as a reviewer or approver, doing analytics and reporting, almost anybody in your business could be a user of your P2P solution. So it's a really crucial decision when you select a provider and go down that path of implementation, and you want to know that that provider that you select has that customer-centric, flexible model, is a long-term player to support such a long-term bet in the space. So that's just a little bit from the Forrester wave, e-procurement, what's driving some of these trends in the space and that rebirth of P2P or P2P 2.0, as I mentioned. So let's talk about more specifically what are some of the challenges unique to mid-market and high-growth organizations. And first maybe a little bit of a definition. A lot of people use the term mid-market with a variety of different definitions in mind. And for purposes of our discussion, we say mid-market, we're still talking about a cross-section of the market that would include some fairly substantial and rapidly growing organizations. So for purposes of our discussion, we'll talk about anyone that's currently below $2 billion in annual revenue. So as I said, that certainly includes lots of organizations that have achieved a certain scale and often find that they need to really upgrade, as we said in the title for the session today, you may have outgrown or you've outgrown your procurement tools. So with that definition in mind, a mid-market organization at the top level has business goals that really aren't that much different from a larger enterprise. Most businesses are looking at how do we increase our business growth and profitability. Maybe one difference being in this segment, there's an awful lot of merger and acquisition activity as well. So many of these organizations that are looking to scale may be doing that through a combination of organic as well as inorganic growth. So certainly M&A activity presents a whole set of challenges from an overall business standpoint as well as from a procurement standpoint. But they're all looking for improving growth, profitability, speed to market, while simultaneously reducing operational costs, which has historically, of course, been procurement's focus. And with regard to procurement-specific goals and specific to this segment of the market, really looking at as the business grows and matures, the volumes are starting to overwhelm the procurement function in many cases. So much higher volumes of purchase orders, invoices, those transactions are growing rapidly. Meanwhile, as the spend volume increases, the supply base is proliferating as well. So that increases the coordination costs or the challenge of onboarding and managing a diverse supply base. And, especially in those high growth organizations where purchases are made oftentimes in the most expedient fashion to support the business growth, sometimes at the expense of compliance. So many of these organizations are really focused on how do I support business growth but do it in a compliant way to make sure that we're getting the best value. Now, the other set of unique challenges that we see in the mid-market and high-growth segment relate to technology in particular, that this segment has not had historically the benefit of the latest best-of-breed technology. So oftentimes they're trying to make do or struggling with, some fairly antiquated legacy or homegrown systems that they've now outgrown. And simultaneously, these organizations typically have very constrained IT resources and budgets, so they can't look to IT to help, develop applications certainly, and in terms of doing the implementation and support, the available resources may be extremely limited. So a whole host of challenges for mid-market organizations, both from a business, procurement, as well as a technology standpoint. So we'll really delve into how can some of the new innovations in the space help overcome some of these challenges. And just to frame the challenge in more procurement-specific terms, what we see is that most organizations are really grappling with the challenge of having a disproportionate percentage of their resources focused currently on transactional procurement tests. So if you look at some of the benchmarks here from CAP's research, for example, they highlight some of the differences or nuances from industry to industry, but across industries, the average allocation of procurement FTEs, or full-time equivalent resources, is almost two-thirds, 62%, to these tactical transactional activities like PO processing or invoice processing, as compared to just 38% of resources allocated to strategic activities like category management, supplier management, strategic sourcing. And overall, the goal, of course, is how do we flip that switch, really invert that picture to the point where we're allocating the majority of resources to strategic as compared to tactical activities. So certainly the goal in this critical first step of automating transactional procurement is how do we change that imbalance, how do we reduce the friction in these transactional processes by shrinking the time, taking the paper and the cost out of the process, and also increasing compliance by reducing that non-PO or maverick spend, and along the way get better transparency to the full process and spending activity to make better strategic decisions when I'm able to change this equation of the time allocation to focus more on strategic activities. So with all of these challenges in mind, this is where we've developed what we call the Zycus Genesys value proposition. So Genesys, of course, is a starting point. And when we've examined the needs of this particular segment of the market, we've really identified the fact that the first step is an automation of that transformational procure-to-pay process to be able to effectively support the growth in the business. And, we think this is really for the first time the kind of compelling value proposition that makes the best-of-breed solutions like the Zycus platform that's been recognized as a leader by Gartner and Forrester alike, now accessible not just to the large enterprises, those $2 billion and above, but all of the mid-market and high-growth organizations below that threshold for whom many of these solutions have been out of reach historically from a budget standpoint. So really, how do we make available, first of all, that best-in-class procurement solution that can drive the kind of intuitive, guided buying user experience that's going to drive rapid adoption for the users. And rapid adoption has to be coupled with a rapid implementation or fast-track implementation approach because, especially for organizations in this segment, the mid-market and high growth, results need to be immediate. They're not prepared to wait for, implementation cycles that extend 12 months and beyond before they start to see that payback and return on investment. So really critical for this segment and part of the Zycus Genesys value proposition is how do we streamline the implementation process such that it can be completed in a very rapid cycle, 8 to 12 weeks. And that's accomplished by, first of all, leveraging out-of-the-box best practices and expert resources. And Grant will provide a lot more detail on that as we go along. And also be mindful of the fact that, as I said earlier, very few organizations have IT resources at the ready. So leveraging a cloud delivery platform that really offloads the lion's share of those IT-related tasks to the solution provider. So the solution, after all, is in the cloud. It's hosted, so there's no requirement for IT to deploy servers or install software. And not only that, the solution provider can really drive the supplier onboarding process such that you've really significantly minimized and mitigated any IT support that's required to accomplish this kind of a rapid implementation. And last but not least, it has to be affordable, easy to buy and easy to own. And in this regard, we've really structured the offering such that it's not only affordable but very predictable. So a fixed annual cost that smooths out the investment for both software and implementation over the time horizon of the investment over multiple years, so that you've got that predictable, budgetable expense. It smooths out the investment so that you achieve payback faster and, of course, a positive ROI much faster as well. And to boil it all down, essentially, this can be accomplished in less than 90 days for about the cost of what a typical procurement organization would have in compensation and benefits for a single employee or FTE. So very affordable, fast-paced implementation, and a rapid ROI. Give you a little bit more of the specifics about what this entails. I've focused a lot, talked a lot about procure to pay as kind of that cornerstone, that transactional engine that supports all this, but a couple of other critical components to really make this a closed loop process, a fully compliant process is, no procure to pay solution is going to be firing on all cylinders if you can't effectively onboard and manage suppliers as well. So supplier information management bundled in as an integrated module in this approach to effectively onboard the suppliers. And the other critical piece here that was often overlooked, quite frankly, during the first generation of procure to pay, where so much of the focus was on catalog type buying, the contract repository, again, bundled and fully integrated into P2P, because so much of the spending is, in fact, non-catalog based for services or non-standard products. So in lieu of a catalog, having the contract available at the point of requisition to drive the process, which for most organizations, that non-catalog spend might constitute as much as 3/4 of the total indirect spending that you'd look to put through a procure-to-pay solution. So it's really these three modules bundled together, and of course the procure-to-pay, including all of those elements that you'd expect here, an automated approval workflow process enabling paperless orders, requisitions, POs, and invoice processing on the back end, a mix of hosted or punch-out catalogs to maximize the on-catalog spend, but as I said, also having the contract information available for non-catalog purchases as well. And the other thing that we see here is in the procure-to-pay cycle, oftentimes there's a requirement for which either a catalog or a contract doesn't already exist. So there's a need to then source that requisition. So having a quick source process embedded and integrated to enable what we call a rec-to-quote bid process. So, for a particular product or service requirement, you need to go out and collect at least three competitive bids, and then quickly award business in a seamless way, process that purchase order from the shopping cart. So that all is enabled here, as well as at the completion of this transactional process, of course, there's a payment that needs to be generated to the supplier and the transaction posted to the general ledger. So completing the cycle, closing the loop through integration to the ERP system to effect that payment and posting to GL. And so all of these processes being supported from the initial supplier setup and onboarding through the availability of catalogs, contracts, through processing requisitions, POs and invoices, and all with the supplier network supporting that, and with the supplier information management tools to effectively onboard and manage suppliers. So what does success look like if you've done all these things? And I'll borrow from the Hackett group here that has identified three characteristics of top-performing purchase-to-pay organizations. And the first one is that they have a focus on internal stakeholders. So they're making it easier for end users to do the right thing. And the payoff is that top-performing organizations are able to guide their users to the preferred channel, meaning buying from an approved contracted vendor at negotiated pricing in the approved or prescribed way. So 85% of transactions for top performers are, in fact, following that preferred approach, whereas just 61% for the average organization. So that's certainly less than desired compliance in that particular case. And this is an area where when we look at the Zycus Genesys solution, some of the unique innovation really revolves around the use of artificial intelligence, AI, to enable a guided buying approach so that the system has the smarts to know what a user is looking for, present them only with the relevant category of search results from approved contracted vendors, and also knows, again, has the intelligence to know who they are in the organization, what their role is, and therefore what the approval workflow needs to be. So it invokes a category-specific approval workflow driven by that organization's embedded business rules, and also has the intelligence to map from the AI-assigned category code to your appropriate GL account and default all the information for the end user. So nothing frustrates an end user more than getting to a checkout screen and having to enter a battery of information, including a 14-digit account string, and guess at what the commodity code should be and put in my ship to, bill to information. What guided buying is all about, using artificial intelligence, is to take that guesswork away from the end users and drive that kind of 85% or higher compliance in terms of using the approved process. The second characteristic that Hackett identifies is the digital nature of the information itself that results in almost twice as much spend visibility at a granular level and significantly higher spend compliant to contracts, so better than 2/3 of spending. 67% for top performers compliant to contract, less than half for the peer group overall. And this is the case where the innovation from the Zycus Genesys standpoint has been this contract lock feature, where we've integrated the contracts at the point of requisition in P2P so that you can do all of these things. You can go seamlessly from onboarding a supplier to take the contracted pricing and terms directly into a catalog. You can reference the contract when the PO is generated, and also have a much more straightforward resolution for any non-PO invoices that still show up by being able to access and refer to the contract itself. And the final characteristic here is, in fact, an automated process, a paperless process. And that can really only be accomplished by being able to onboard and enable a critical mass of suppliers, because after all, you're sending the POs to the suppliers who have to acknowledge and confirm those, who have to send you the turnaround documents such as an invoice or maybe an advanced ship notice. And top performers have really focused on taking the paper out of the process to a much more significant extent than average performers overall. So almost twice as likely to have paperless or no-touch orders, and almost four times as likely to have e-invoices as opposed to paper invoices. And in this case, the Genesys approach has really been to focus dedicated supplier onboarding resources to the critical mass of suppliers that comprise the vast majority of transactions. So here, as in many cases, the 80-20 rule applies and holds true. So how do we focus on that 20%, or in some cases less, of suppliers that actually account for 80% of the transactions, and do that in the first 90 days to ensure success? And success, of course, has to include the financial metrics. Lots of detailed calculations here that I won't go through, but for most organizations, it will be a critical step to put together a compelling business case ROI. So that looks at what are the benefits both of spend cost reduction through improved compliance, coupled with process efficiency gains by automating the transactional flows. And here we've looked at, let's say a typical situation for a mid-market or high-growth organization. Let's say they have $100 million in spend, going from kind of an average level of performance to best-in-class capabilities would conservatively net somewhere between 2 to 3% of the spend on an annual basis as savings. So in this case, nearly $3 million on $100 million in spend. So for organizations of all sizes, that's a realizable, realistic goal, and certainly will present an extremely compelling return on investment scenario. So when we vision what success looks like, we wanted to share some case studies too, and then talk about how to do it. And so a case study is a great place to start that discussion of how to do it when you look at how have others done it. So in this case, there's a company that's sort of squarely in the middle of the range of what we've defined as mid-market or high-growth organizations in the banking and financial services industries, in fact, an insurance company. And the starting point was they were making do as best they could with just what was available through the existing, incumbent ERP solution, happened to be SAP in this case, but could be almost anybody. But what they found was they really didn't have an efficient, consistent process for onboarding suppliers or processing requisitions, orders, and invoices. So lots of non-PO spending, no single version of the truth, and extensive manual steps and rework throughout the process really hampered their performance. So clearly they needed this type of a transformation such as we're talking about here with the Genesys program. And what was accomplished in pretty short order was, similar to what I recommended earlier in the strategy, is use that 80-20 rule. Focus on the 20% of suppliers, in this case about 500 suppliers that were targeted for the initial onboarding, which are going to account for 80% or more of the volume. That's how you know you're going to get a rapid payback. And make sure that you've got the right enablement method for different segments of the supply base. So here again, the 80-20 rule applied. So the top tier of suppliers that is already e-commerce savvy can use standard protocols like CXML or EDI, which was done for 20% of these suppliers, but 80% simply needed access through a browser to the portal to be able to transact electronically with the buying customer, this insurance company. And so the availability of the technology, not just to internal users, but to the supply base, really translated to benefits, as well as a strong endorsement by the buying organization that this would be expected, a mandatory program for suppliers to participate in. And in this case, Go Live was in fact achieved ahead of schedule with a critical mass, not only of catalog vendors enabled, but also that type of contract-based buying through guided e-forms that made sure that they had a critical mass of usage on board. And at the end, the results speak for themselves here, dramatically reducing cycle time, being able to reallocate resources to more strategic activities, saving 40% of the time, for instance, on the back end in the AP, and actually implementing a no PO or no pay policy in this case. So that's just one look, snapshot. And what I'd like to do is ask Grant now to take us through another case study approach and really then segue into what are the implementation steps that organizations can take now to get started to really drive this kind of a fast track implementation approach. So Grant, why don't you take us through the next case study?
Thank you, Richard. That was an excellent introduction to the Zycus Genesys. Thanks again. You can see here Zycus and VSG, we work together to help one of the largest healthcare companies in the U.S. There's some statistics provided there on the left-hand side. This client, similar to the previous case study, this client was using an outdated version of their ERP's procurement module. In this case, it was Oracle, a little bit different. The system was unreliable, inefficient. They had a growing procurement organization. But for the most part, the procurement teams were working in silos, right? So that produced weak and unorganized processes for procurement, didn't know which suppliers to buy from, a lot of preferential supplier treatment, a lot of contract leakage or for the most part, just poor contract compliance overall. So it was a free-for-all from a procurement perspective, creating a lot of frustration for the sourcing and contract managers at the corporate HQ. So we also found that their incumbent system, as we said before, was difficult to use, which resulted in a lot of sort of non-PO purchases and free text buys, right? So people just filling out text and not really providing catalog data or supplier information that was essential to tracking the spend. Ultimately producing or not producing very good visibility into their spending, which ultimately, as we know, made it impossible to effectively conduct strategic sourcing and to manage their spend holistically. So what we did, again, Velocity with Zycus, we did some upfront due diligence to effectively develop a better set of source-to-pay workflows. But that was only part of it, where we had to also look at their policies and processes to not only address how were we going to develop the workflow and the sort of the system configuration and integrations, we also had to look at, since this organization was working in sort of a siloed approach, the processes were somewhat broken, not a whole lot of use of really bona fide catalogs. We had to take all that into consideration. So it wasn't just purely a how do we configure the tool, how do we integrate the tool. It was how do we make it work the best when we put it in the hands of the users, because that's what's important to adoption, right? So then we were able to implement the Zycus suite of solutions that the organization, again, was very comfortable and to a better extent, more excited about using. Which was important. I think that this collaboration of the two teams produced not only the workflows and configuration and integration components that were necessary to implement the solution, but take out complexity, right, through process optimization and through ultimately getting a better use of the tool through various ways of leveraging and condensing their process and policy into the utilization of Zycus, making it easy to use. The solution is in itself easy to use, but it's what you put into it, right? And I think that collaboration between the three teams, the client, Zycus, and Velocity, produced that. So that when we turned on the solution, effectively went live, the organization had that reduction in complexity, easy to use solution with improved cycle time, that also maintain that level of procurement governance that the CPO and CFO were both desiring at the onset of the project. So overall, a very effective combination from a project execution perspective. Towards the end, right, when we're getting close to, as I said earlier, go live, we certainly had to pair not only the system configuration and integration components, we have to look at how are we going to train the organization. So certainly we put forth a strong effort in customizing the training to fit the organization. We developed effective communication strategy that helped us sort of create more awareness to the solution, sort of on the front end, during, and after, to make sure that the usership was ready, right, for the solution, that they were actively involved. So I believe that that hands-on approach to communication and training was a key in helping us make this project a success. Getting the stakeholders actively involved early and often really does go a long way, and it did with this particular client. Working in a very collaborative environment was very positive. So now at the end, right, we have this user environment that could more effectively access catalogs, buy from the preferred suppliers, get better contract compliance, no longer working in silos, working in one bona fide solution that everyone has visibility with the necessary controls to manage procurement from source to pay. Oh, and, obviously at this stage, the sourcing and contract managers were much happier. So now they had the ability to manage and react to spend in a more proactive way. Let's click to the next slide, Richard. So we think about the implementation philosophy. So you see that there's essentially the three-part procurement solution for Zycus Genesys, right? On the left, we have the Zycus solution, right? And Richard did a wonderful job of describing what you get from the package for the Genesys program. But really, it's this combination to get a truly effective and solution that realizes value, right? It's the software plus an effective software deployment. It's the implementation, and then obviously you get all the value, all the results at the other end of it by having the combination of the two. So, you know, without an effective sort of design, configuration, and deployment, you know, our clients would have a tough time realizing the value that this Zycus solution is bringing to them. It's often overlooked that this piece is very important, if not equally important, to getting the Zycus solution to that level of value prop. There are many cases where clients overlook the importance of the implementation efforts. Maybe the thinking is that the acquisition of the solution is enough. You know, it's like buying an app. Oh, it'll work, right? Or just the general perception that software today is generally seen as easy to administer, easy to deploy and to use. Well, it can be easy, and we can do it in a short period of time, but it takes the right approach to do that. If we could skip to the next slide, Richard. So the approach, you know, we offer our standard sort of 6-step methodology, or call it a VSG approach, and we do that, you know, through a few ways, right? Over the past 10 years, through our experience in deployment of source-to-pay solutions, we've developed our own playbook, which is essentially our methodology, tools, and templates for leading clients through the implementation. You know, so using this playbook provides for an effective structure for the project team to leverage at every stage of the implementation, right? The playbook combines the processes from both a business and technical perspective. So again, it's not only focused on the system-like needs of the Zycus solution, right? It brings in everything from business process and communications and current state analysis and optimizing future state with using best-in-class techniques and tools, right? So it's all of those things, not just a playbook about how do you configure the Zycus solution. It certainly includes that, but it looks at everything from a more comprehensive perspective and helps the client and implementation teams work together with a playbook that gives them that insight and visibility to every step during the process. We also, you know, we deploy, you know, US-based resources that can be boots on the ground or remote for every project that we do. We find it beneficial to also deploy only Zycus certified experts on each project. So every project that we do will be supported by Zycus certified users, right? This assures essentially that, you know, for the Zycus solution, it's configured and integrated by only the best, right? Again, if we're talking about implementing in 90 days or less, right, we're going to talk about that more, but we implement 90 days or less. We need only the best folks and resources and experts doing that. There's no time for learning on the job, right? So not only do we want them Zycus certified, but we want them to have the right level of P2P experience. And we also want them to have the right level of technical and functional experience. So it's a very unique set of skills and experience to be able to effectively implement the P2P solution for Zycus. So we want to make sure that that is there to make sure that this playbook gets executed effectively. And lastly, certainly, you know, over our, you know, past 2 decades, you know, our team has accumulated a number of best practices and lessons learned through many source-to-pay experiences from each project. So we bring that knowledge to each project. You know, we combine that with a dedicated PMO, right? So every project, even though because it's being done in a fast-paced scenario, we need dedicated project management, right, to ensure the solution is implemented using the best breed techniques and tools and to make sure that this the methodology and playbook are deployed efficiently. Next slide. So here's a sort of a fast-track implementation sample project plan, right? You've seen these sort of chevron views many times. This gives you just a snapshot of what we do and how we do it. So within a mid-market solution offering that Richard overviewed earlier, Zycus Genesys, we've developed an implementation model here that can effectively deliver the solution, to a readiness, go live scenario in about 90 days or 12 weeks. We're able to do this, I think, one, it's, as Richard said, it's an out-of-box solution, cloud delivery, lowered IT involvement, and there's more, support and reliance on the Zycus and the Velocity team for supplier onboarding. So it takes all of those components and then sort of stressors away from the client team, right? We also produce, as I mentioned earlier, the best combination of resources, right? So having a certified team on the ground, sort of boots on the ground, implementing the solution from VSG, combined with the back office technical support from Zycus at the ready, I think it lends itself to making this project plan, effective. And lastly, I mentioned earlier, it's this battle-tested methodology. So combining this out-of-the-box solution, best quality resources, certified, dedicated to the project, with a battle-tested methodology and dedicated PMO, we're able to achieve this timeline, within the 90 days or 12 weeks, if you will. Next slide. There's always this consideration, right, for it's not just about understanding the business, configuring the software, it's also about how do we interact it, how do we integrate it with our ERP, right? So during the ERP integration component of the project, albeit SAP, Oracle, or other systems, the implementation team will emphasize this simplified approach, right? There's the 3 steps for integration that will cover all the key data elements for the integration process, sort of all the technical work that has to get done. It's very open, very defined, and very easy to follow, which also makes the 90 to 12 week, 90 day to 12 week time frame much more easy to pull off. The iConsole helps the technical team essentially efficiently manage the inputs and outputs of the integration, right? All of the data components that have to be managed for the APIs and the connectivities to ERP, that is managed with another solution called iConsole. It's very robust, it's very easy to use. That also helps us with our speed of implementation. And lastly, ZDoc, another solution that helps us from a transition and document management perspective. Helps us organize, manage all the documentation. That there's so much data back and forth between the ERP solution and the Zycus solution that the ZDoc helps us maintain that visibility and organization of that the data and documentation. Another tool that makes it efficient for us to execute on the short-term implementation. When we think about the integration itself, there's really, we talked about Genesys, so when we're doing it in the Genesys model for the mid-market, there's a combination of our team and the Zycus team working with the customer's IT team to collaborate on ERP integration, right? So there's some interaction there. Whereas if you're outside of the mid-market, there's some different level of IT management resources that have to be engaged, depending on the size and scope of the project. Again, Richard, I was trying to go within a fair amount of time. Hopefully I didn't go too fast, so I'll leave it back to you.
Yeah, that's perfect, Grant. And I just wanted to kind of, as we close here and try to take a couple of quick questions, just paint a picture for what the next phase of the evolution looks like, because, again, we've advocated that, especially for mid-market and high-growth organizations, automating transactional procurement is the critical first step. But once you've built that foundation, if you will, it's also important to know that, the Zycus solution, for instance, being a fully integrated end-to-end source-to-pay suite is extensible and scalable from there. So once you've implemented that foundational transactional platform like Procure-to-Pay, coupled with the other components that are bundled in the Genesys package, the contract repository and supplier information management, the next phase could be to expand to a full source-to-pay transformation that brings in contract authoring in addition to the repository, a full-blown e-sourcing tool, end-to-end project management to allocate and track tasks on commodity projects, savings management and tracking, supplier performance measurement. So getting into, in fact, the next level of more strategic and even more sophisticated applications with an extensible, scalable suite of integrated tools is really what the next frontier would be. And to learn more about this approach, we do have a white paper available for download at the website, focused on how to take these steps towards the critical first step in transforming procurement with Zycus Genesys. And with that in mind, I know we've taken most of the time, Grant, but I did have a couple of questions come in and wanted to have you kick us off because, as you talk through the implementation approach, it sort of spurred a question from our audience here. And, what can my organization be doing now to prepare for this kind of an implementation, and what internal stakeholders or resources need to be engaged?
Yeah, it's a good question. It comes up almost every time, right? I think, it's one thing to know or to conceptualize that you need to invest in better procurement technology solutions. It's another to actually sit down in a room and collaborate and whiteboard what are the goals and objectives? Why are we doing this, right? Is it to improve the user experience? Is it to get better contract compliance? Is it to prevent leakage, or is it to better manage our suppliers? There's certainly a number of factors that we think our clients should go through that list and figure out, what am I actually trying to achieve, okay? And then secondly, we talk about stakeholders. We've often thought, right, that any software procurement or software acquisition, is led by IT. I think with the advent of going to the cloud for the most part, it's being more run by the business, by procurement. But we still need to keep the IT folks involved, especially when we think about integration. But I think you're going to have the best success involving IT early on in the decision-making, right, at least involved in the process. Obviously, we want finance and accounts payable, obviously procurement and contract management folks to be involved. I think the more you involve those key functional folks, the earlier the better, the more success you're going to have down the line. And lastly, I guess I go back to preparation, is be thinking about those essential business processes that you want to deploy within your solution. Right? Think about what you're doing today, what are the pain points, and how do you want them to look and feel in the future that will also help you be more ready for an implementation.
Well, that's perfect, Grant. And I know I went through, covered sort of at a very high level, very quickly, the ROI metrics here, and that prompted a question about what's the minimum size organization that can develop an ROI that would support an investment here. And, of course, I'm tempted to kind of say almost any size organization, especially imagine, you're a biotech startup and maybe you're pre-revenue but about to go public or just went public. And, the return on investment argument really isn't as important as how do we get a compliant process, toot sweet, ASAP. In that regard, it really does depend to some extent on what your objectives are. If it's process efficiency, compliance, it becomes less of a purely financial discussion, but oftentimes it is a financially driven discussion. And certainly if we look at the metrics that we presented, conservatively 2 to 3% return on the total spend. If I have as little as $25 million in spend, and at the low end of that range I get 2%, that's $500,000 in savings right there, which would produce a multiple return on my investment, because after all, nobody really wants to just break even, but you're looking for that 5 to 10x kind of return. So as I look at just in purely financial terms, I think certainly size matters to some extent, but even a relatively smaller organization, just $25 million in spend and up, would produce typically a very compelling ROI. is what we're seeing here. And the last question we'll cover as well today is, after implementing this type of solution, how do we know we're successful? What are the key metrics we should be using to track and measure our success? Grant, what would you think are the appropriate sort of top of mind metrics to track at a dashboard level?
Well, yeah, I mean, certainly it's throughput, right? How much have you improved your procurement requisition to PO transactions through the system? I would say compliance, contract compliance is another one. Cycle time, if that's important. Again, when you say a dashboard, it's often really customer specific of things they want to track. Things like sourcing savings, P2P, sort of compliance factors. They're all there, but I would say it's sort of contract compliance, that's use of supplier catalogs, and then there's certainly cycle times that are there. I think you can add a few, obviously, Richard.
Well, that's a great list, and again, I mentioned the business case earlier. It should tie back to the business case that you use to get the funding in the first place. Then you want to measure those same key metrics on an ongoing basis to ensure that you've achieved those results. So in closing today, we'll be sending an email with the slide deck with a link to the recorded archive session of the webinar that you can share with your colleagues. Please visit the website where you can download the white paper on the topic. You'll also find some other tools like ROI calculators that we mentioned to get you started on the business case development. We can certainly help with further consultation. Please reach out with any additional questions. I want to thank everyone for joining. Thank you, Grant, for your participation, and look forward to another opportunity to engage in the future.
Yes, thank you, Richard. Thank you all for attending.
Thanks, everyone.